Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Today, I'm with Dr. Serhat Yilmaz from Loughborough University and Lerina Bright from Mission 89. And we're here to discuss the recently released Global Thematic Report on Sport Trafficking, developed in partnership with Mission 89, Commonwealth Parliament Association UK and Loughborough University, and led by Dr. Serhat Yilmaz. In this podcast, we seek to raise awareness of the issues of sport being used as a vehicle to traffic children. We discuss the development of the Global Thematic Report on Sport Trafficking with a variety of examples and provide recommendations about what should be done to prevent sport trafficking in the future.
Hi, Serhat. Hi, Lerina. Thanks for coming on the Experts in Sport podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Nice to see you both and nice to meet you, Lerina. Regular listeners will be aware that Serhat's been on a couple of episodes before. So episode 41, representing minors as a football agent, and episode 38, FIFA's new licensing model for football agents. You're becoming a bit of a regular on the podcast, Serhat. This is your hat trick. I don't think anybody else has had a hat trick so far. So you're used to being on here, so we're expecting big things.
No, thank you. Thanks for the invite, and I hope listener has enjoyed those episodes.
I'm sure they did. But for anyone who didn't listen to those podcasts, feel free to go and listen to them. But can you give them a brief introduction of who you are and your work?
Yes. So I'm Dr. Serhat Yilmaz. I'm a senior lecturer in sports law. And first and foremost, I'm a legal scholar. So my specialism is law, and I specialize on sports law. And alongside that, my research really has been focusing on safeguarding of young talent in sport, and particularly understanding the challenges that undermine the welfare of young athletes. And in that context, I use children's rights as a main legal framework, and I try to understand, first of all, how these issues impact on the rights of the child and young athletes, and as well as how we can develop right-based, child-centered solution to tackle some of these problems.
Thanks, Serhat, and that's really what we're going to get into later on. And Lerina, can you tell us about yourself and also about Mission 89?
Well, thank you for having me, Martin. And again, yes, Lerina Bright, and I'm the Executive Director of Mission 89, which is an international NGO that's based in Geneva, that's working to prevent trafficking and exploitation of athletes. So we work as an organization extensively with various stakeholders. We've done that across 14 plus different countries. Through our initiatives such as the Not in Our Game campaign, which focuses on awareness raising and multi-stakeholder capacity building. And the aim always has been to drive this discussion around this phenomena of sport trafficking. We've been engaged over the years with organizations such as FIFA, such as Interpol, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK, which, by the way, is a partner also of this project, of the production of the Global Thematic Report on Sport Trafficking. We've also worked with numerous sport federations. And as Serhat knows, because he's been there with us as well, we've been at the United Nations General Assembly, where we organized for the last 3 years side events that brought this issue to the international community. So that's a bit of a, and also I should add that I come from a sport management background. I did my master's degree in Lausanne at the AISTS. So, of course, Loughborough is huge, but we like to think the AISTS in Lausanne it comes up there. And I worked with the Bahrain Football Association. I started my career, I shouldn't miss this out, at the Irish Football Association in Belfast, where I launched the club licensing scheme and worked at CONCACAF and a number of different sport federations. And I wanted to mention this because it's important to say that during my time in these many different sports institutions, issues such as safeguarding, human rights, forgets trafficking, These are concepts to many sport organizations, and I never heard of them while I was there. So there's often a big gap between what it is that there's a big gap between the administration of the sport or the governance of the sport and what is actually happening on the pitches, the technical side. And so that's where my understanding, even though it doesn't mean that there should be a lack of accountability, but I understand, or rather understood, when we would meet with sport federation officials and they would maybe not necessarily have an idea of this happening, because again, there's that gap of knowledge and information.
It's a really good point you've ended on there. I was going to say, like, Mission 89, you seem to be connected and working with people all over the place at a very high level. So there's an awareness that this situation exists. And you then mentioned at the club level, they're probably not as aware. At the fan level, and the bigger world of sport, I do think there is a lack of awareness of this issue. So hopefully this podcast can help raise that profile of this as an issue. So could you just touch upon now, just give us a slight overview of, what is the issue? How big is this issue? Where are these sport trafficking incidents happening? And then we'll go into some more depth of case studies later on. But just as an overview, what is the problem with sports trafficking? How big is it? Where is it occurring?
Well, how big is it? Well, first of all, trafficking in general, in all its forms, it's a hidden form. It's a hidden crime, basically. So it's in plain sight, but many people don't recognize it. Many people obviously don't know what the definition is. And so it becomes very difficult to identify and to quantify, right? But what we have learned through, again, our initiative, the Not in Our Game campaign, which is where we've organized many of these different forums across the world, in Nigeria, in Thailand, in Egypt. Basically, when we begin with the young people and we ask, do you know what human trafficking is? No, they have no clue. But by the time that we have explained to them what it is, the hands go more than three quarters of hands go up, and that's because they know somebody that has happened to. And this is why the report, and this is why it's so important to have a definition, because that is the beginning of understanding the scale of it, of starting to quantify the numbers, but for sure. Once people know what we're talking about, they then understand that this is closer to them than they realize. But it's happening it's a lot of times people think that it's an African problem, African youth trying to make it to Europe. But this is happening in all the different continents. In South America, you have baseball players in particular from Cuba, and we'll go more in depth with that, I know. But, you've got baseball players trying to get into the Major League Baseball in the US. You've got South Americans also trying to get to Europe. And you've got, for example, rugby players in the Pacific Islands trying to get to Australia. So it's all over.
I think we'll go into some more depth in it. Serhat, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and also just building on what Lerina is outlining. So from also research perspective, we are trying to, through the report, we are trying to address this research gap on this issue as well, because we have got some existing academic work, but first of all, this academic work is very limited. So we need to do much more research on this issue. But alongside that, what we realize in our research, one of the limitation of the academic work is basically the linking the findings from the field with respect to this phenomena with this legal definition of human trafficking, because it also creates limitation in terms of our understanding. As Lerina said, globally, we have got internationally recognized definition established by a UN protocol. the Palermo Protocol, as it's known. And in that definition, human trafficking has three definitional elements: the act, the means, and exploitative purpose. So therefore, when we work on this topic from research perspective, and that's what the global thematic report does, it tries to align the issue with this legal definition, recognized legal definition of human trafficking. And then obviously it makes that connection, but also it illustrates how it manifests based on identifying these three definitional elements. So this is, for us, we see that as a main limitation of the existing research. And this is something we are advocating through the report for those, particularly for the academia, when they are researching this topic for the future research, as a future research direction, we must ensure that we utilize the legal definition of human trafficking.
And I think the point to add, if I've understood this rightly from the report, is that the need for that definition should help in terms of courts of law and holding people accountable to these actions. Because from what I read, it seemed like people who may be attempted to be charged for certain aspects of this are getting away with it due to loopholes in laws or lack of definitions, or it coming down as something that's not trafficking in a court of law, and therefore the punishment is not as serious as it should and could be. Is that why this definition is so important?
Exactly. I mean, you are right on it, Martin, because for instance, from law enforcement perspective, as you know, to prosecute under criminal law, you must establish the crime. And therefore, once you look at the phenomena, and perhaps this is why it's remained hidden, isn't it, Lerina? Because if you don't understand, you don't look for those criminal elements, then you are not able to see it. And that's why our focus has been to align the problem and build our understanding based on the legal definition of human trafficking as a crime, because it's needed to tackle this problem.
You know, one of the challenges of preventing this issue or tackling it is, I believe, comes with a definition. Now, when we were creating that working or policy definition that is sports trafficking, we made sure that we aligned it with the international recognized definition of human trafficking, which is the Palermo Protocol. But it has been my practical experience that when I'm talking about this topic, particularly with sports stakeholders, you know, they immediately get it. They see where the exploitation is. And then when I move towards actually reading the definition, you see that they start to lose it. You lose them with the definition because the definition is so complex and it's so technical. You know, and you know, I know Serhat and I and the rest of the team, you know, we went back and forth on the definition. And my goal was always for us to have a more simplified version or a simplified form of it. But there was no getting around it because, you know, with the definition of trafficking, if you miss one element, then it no longer constitutes trafficking, right? So, and why that's important is that then when you're communicating with, again, sports stakeholders, and, you know, we're all from the sports world, you know, it's very difficult for them to understand that. Now, when we work with law enforcement, for example, Mission 89 is a member of the Human Trafficking Expert Group of Interpol. They get it because these are the frameworks they work around. But if our aim is to primarily to prevent this issue, to bring awareness, the definition itself is quite problematic in its complexity.
Well, when I read it, and I'll read a bit of it out now, you know, I thought it brings it home. If we're saying, look, this is actually really big thing, and you know, I think to give understanding to the listeners, I think that the definition that you guys have produced might be helpful. So the definition from what I saw in the paper says sports trafficking is the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving an individual, typically an athlete or aspiring athlete, within or across borders through coercive, deceptive, or other abusive means for the purpose of exploitation in, through, or around sports. Exploitation may manifest as forced labor, sexual exploitation, slavery, servitude within sport-related activities or events.
And in the case of children, that's very important. In the case of children, no means need to be present.
What does that bit mean at the end?
So it basically means that, and Serhat, maybe you can jump in as someone that's legal and technical. You can jump in and explain that aspect, and then I'll build on it as well.
Yeah. So again, Martin, that comes from actually the Palermo Protocol, because the definition of trafficking in person or human trafficking within the protocol also makes distinction between adult trafficking and child trafficking. And when we define child trafficking, the way definition incorporates that is basically, then for child trafficking, you need two elements rather than three definitional elements. So means element is not needed because of that's about the capacity of the child and the vulnerability. So therefore, definition recognizes that as soon as you've got the act element and the exploitative purpose, then it constitutes child trafficking. So you don't need to establish.
So they don't need to agree. They don't need to be deceived.
Exactly.
They don't need to, because they cannot give consent, basically. Yeah.
I had a question on that, which I'm going to leave for later on. I think it'd be good for us to then talk a little bit, if we can, around, within the definition, we've got exploitation in, through, or around sport. So I think it might be useful to talk around what are those three things? What is trafficking in sport, through sport, and around sport, and give some overall ideas so people can understand what this is and how it happens.
I mean, I can come on that because again we have a number of debates, discussion about this. This what we define as the subsets of definition. So trafficking in sport, trafficking through sport, and trafficking around sport. So definition encompasses three subsets of sport trafficking. And the reason we have those subsets, first of all, in the existing research, the sport trafficking is based on two subsets, in sport and through sport. But when we engage with the project and with the work, we realize that particularly the trafficking around mega sport events. So we try to basically understand and establish and clarify whether actually trafficking through sport as a subset and as a concept actually fully capture this phenomena. So in terms of trafficking in sport, it's quite straightforward. It's about exploitation of athletes.
That's happening in sport.
So that's the key characteristics of the trafficking in sport, and that's basically there's a direct role of sport there because exploitation occurs within sport. Okay.
Can you give us a story around that? Because I think our listeners would be keen to hear, a case study, an overview of how does that manifest? What are we talking about actually happens here from a personal level? So we're talking about an athlete or a potential athlete being good at their sport in their native country, let's say, which, as we said before, we know those of us who are around this know that there's been a lot of talk around this around football in particular, but we do know this exists in baseball and other places, or many other places. But the story of that individual and that person, so if we do go from a football perspective as an example, they are playing their sport in their country. What happens next?
So in this case, basically, the process is quite straightforward. So as you said, if we think about an athlete, the athlete transferred for instance, there's an element of transfer there, or athlete is recruited. So we have got the act element, and then once they moved, and for the exploitative purpose, and that's usually, it could be a sporting entity that will involve in the exploitative purpose, initiate that, and that could be through maybe having exploitative contracts with a club, with team, or in individual sports, it might be maybe with exploitative contracts around competitions, with coaches, intermediaries. So, but fundamental to this is that there is the main victim is the athlete, and they tend to participate in sport. So there is a direct engagement with sport.
So African footballers as young as 14 were trafficked to Laos some years back, and they were forced to sign exploitative contracts. Champasak United, which is one of the top clubs in Laos, they had imported as many as 23 underage players from West Africa, most of them or some of them from Liberia, and to an unregistered academy, which violates FIFA's regulations because they prohibit the international transfer of players under the age of 18. So these young players were promised salaries and accommodation, but instead they were forced to sleep on the floor of the club's stadium without proper facilities. They were made to work outside the football program that they were on. Players as young as 14 were coerced into signing 6-year contracts and were made to play in senior league games, which is another clear breach of FIFA rules. Following pressure from FIFA and as well FIFPro, which is the Global Players Union, some of those teenagers were released, but another 6, I believe, that were minors remained with the club. I know that FIFPro then investigated the case, and they stated that they suspected, obviously, that this is not a one-of-a-kind situation, that it happens more often than is reported. And basically, it's a scheme that was designed to eventually profit from selling these young players. And it really exposed a troubling pattern of exploitation in the football pipeline.
The two elements that I want to ask about in this space, from some knowledge that I have, and I say this a lot, I have enough knowledge to be dangerous in everything. So you guys need to kind of put me back in my cage if this isn't the case. So the story in my head very much goes that a legitimate or a not legitimate agent, is getting hold of players and trying to get them potentially across to Europe, or certainly across to other places. And the journey can go that a player often needs to then pay some money to the agent to start with. Sometimes these players get money. The family use all the money they can to allow somebody to follow their dreams, or somebody loans some money somewhere to make this happen. That journey then goes, and sometimes legitimately they go to another country. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes that when they don't, they still owe that money, and that causes problems in the village for their family and causes problems for themselves. If they do, and whether it's coming over to Europe or not, sometimes again it's legitimate, and there is this get into football trials and potentially try and make it. They don't make it, and therefore they're left in Europe somewhere without anything to do, and they then go down a road of, oh, I owe this money. If you want to pay this money back, maybe you can do these things for me. And it turns into criminal acts or sexual exploitation and those types of things. So there's two elements with that. There's these people who are knowingly taking these players over, knowing that that's going to happen, and they've purposely done that. I think, is there also an element where actually they're bringing some players over in the hope that they become professional footballers? And I think that the number we know is less than 1% of players in England who get into the academy structure don't make it as football players. So there's a bigger thing here in my head, in that some of this is legitimate, but yet it still causes a problem, because even players who get released at professional clubs here, there's not much of a support network for them.
To return to where they came from.
Exactly. So where is that in place for any of the professional clubs or that are allowing these players to come over to say, well, if it doesn't work out, what are we going to do? Is that story, in my head, that story makes sense on both those levels? Is that what's going on, and what can be done in
That happens a lot. That happens a lot, whereby there may be a legitimate trial. The player has paid for, for the travel, for expenses, and once they're not successful, so they would go to multiple trials, which the agent would organize. But once they're not successful, then they're abandoned, right? And the agent has no financial incentive to then pay for return flight for the player. But secondly, the player also doesn't want to return because there's that shame, right? And so then they expose themselves and become more vulnerable. And that's where what you mentioned, because then, because of, I wouldn't say only because of their talent, but normally they would have attracted attention somehow. And you have these criminal networks that then move into them, and they move into, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, domestic servitude, which is where, you have, and that was not to digress, but Sir Mo Farah story, that by the way is not a case of sport trafficking, because he was actually trafficked to the UK to become a domestic worker, to become a servant. So it was through sport that he then, changed his life, but he was brought in to become a helper, as to other kids. So that's what that's what would happen also to those that may have come in through sport, but then, in a means to survive, and also to repay debts. They would rather stay in the country, work, and hopefully settle any kind of debts back home and avoid shame.
Just building on Lerina. So you basically, what you outline is this process, isn't it? And I think it's a nice context to understand these different subsets of sport trafficking. Because if we, for instance, take the initial process, whether it's a legitimate agent or an intermediary, and let me pause there, because this is quite fundamental in terms of our understanding of this phenomena, particularly in the world of football. Under the report also, we try to fully explain, and also we were mindful the two concepts. One is the agent, and under the report we define agent as someone who is authorized to provide agent services, and that's usually through either a registration with a governing body or licensing. Then anybody that doesn't have that formal regulated status, then we define them as intermediaries. Okay, so that's how we need to think about this actor, and it's one of the core actor in the process, in the trafficking process. But then, if we think about the trafficking in sport, so what tends to happen is that this intermediary agent takes the talent to play and participate in sport, and they might have a contractual relationship where they benefit, so they are materially enriched, which is the definition of exploitation, from the sporting activity of the talent. And that's the concept of trafficking in sport. Now, then the other case might be where, again, they might moved by the agent. There are those trials. It's then the talent fails, and now engagement with sport comes to end. And then eventually they might be exposed to this further or onward exploitation. And that could be outside sport, within sport. So you see, therefore, then we need to think about, okay, there is element of trafficking in sport there, but potentially we need trafficking through sport element is there as well, because there's no longer exploitation is no longer within sport, although the process starts with that, and eventually it can be where athlete is no longer taking sporting activity, and there you have still, whether it's a sporting actor or non-sporting actor, is engaging exploitation, right?
Yep.
So
Martin,
hence it's
sorry,
the complexity of the matter and the need for conceptual clarity.
What about, I think maybe we could also talk about contracts, exploitative contracts, because Serhat, that's also a huge part of trafficking in sports. I mean, we know, for example, of a case with a former Ghanaian international who played for many top clubs in Europe, and earning millions. And it was only at his final club, I think this was in Italy, where somebody within the club thought it was very unusual, his living circumstances. I mean, you see how football players in general behave and how they dress, and they're, and he was minimalist, or in many respects. And they, through inquiry, they found out that his agent was basically garnishing all those wages. And the club then, and I guess that's a good club, found a way to divert the money into another account, so that he had he had possession of his own earnings. And so there you have a case of a professional footballer, because I know many times people think trafficking must be a young, vulnerable, poor, aspiring individual, but there are professional players that are in trafficking conditions, but they just don't know it.
And I think it's really important to address that it is happening and still happening at these levels. I had a question about kind of third party ownership, but it's not quite on the third party ownership, or is it? Where does that sit? It's just a contractual obligation to pay a certain percentage or whatever. Is that a different thing?
I mean, if like the concept of third parties is just somebody else outside the contractual relationship as a third party. Like if we use an example from football, isn't it? When you have got the two clubs and the player, right, as the core parties of a football transaction, right, and then you've got somebody else, which is third party, and it's fully based on economic enrichment, right? Because that third party is making
that's labor exploitation, which is
in order to have a return from that economic investment. Although, like, third party as a concept, we might, and we know that it's now globally banned, but there are reports that it's still
absolutely
undergoing behind closed doors. Like we need to acknowledge that. But I think what it illustrates the contractual mechanisms to actually economically exploit the talent, right? Whether we define it as a third party, whether it happens with club contracts, or whether it happens with agent contracts, right? Or whether it happens with an intermediary outside the ecosystem because they don't have regulated status. But it's still what is happening, economic exploitation of the talent through their sport participation, sporting labor.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic that we could go down in terms of the legal ins and outs around that. And I know in previous podcasts we have spoken a little bit around like FIFA regulations around agents and things like that. So I think there's some pieces in those other podcasts that might be worth listeners taking on board if they're interested in that space. I'm just conscious of time, and you guys have talked about the transportation in and through sport, but you also mentioned about trafficking, sport trafficking around sport. Can you give us a bit of an example of that? And then we'll probably then move on to look at our, your recommendations in the future around this space.
Basically, and this is one of the novel contribution of the report, because what we did under the report now, as I said, we introduced that third subset of the sport trafficking, which is trafficking around sport, in order to offer conceptual clarity. And for us, the around sport this time is what we are seeing. The key characteristics of it is that victim is not the athlete, and more importantly, victim has nothing to do with sport in terms of participation. So it's more about where sport offering context for trafficking. And that's basically, if we think about mega sport events, it's labor exploitation, labor trafficking, where workers brought into
and sexual exploitation as well. Yeah.
Work of the stadiums, development, so on and so forth. For instance, we have got reports on that, and report again provides case studies around that, or the concept of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, because of the context that mega sporting events and sporting events in general offers, due to the increased number of fun engagement with the space, so on and so forth. So therefore, essentially here, in terms of trafficking around sport, we are looking at this phenomena that where the participation, the victim is not athlete, and the participation of the victim is not there. It's just happening around sport.
In terms of examples, I think from the report, I think Qatar 2020, and this was fairly newsworthy for anyone who was interested at the time. The exploitation of workers who were building the stadiums and potentially not getting paid, or housed in terrible conditions and those kind of things. That's one of the elements you're talking about, I think. Is that kind of thing?
Correct.
So again,
correct, yes.
Potential for that ongoing when people are building these stadiums and things around new events around the world. But the other one you were talking about slightly there, you talked about sexual exploitation. And I think, again, from your report, there's a report mentioned there around things like the Super Bowl. Could you touch upon that and kind of what kind of thing is going on around those events?
I mean, it's as Serhat mentioned, trafficking around sport is basically, all the exploitation that is connected to, the sporting event, and labor exploitation is one, and sexual exploitation is the other. Obviously the most that we've heard around, or the focus has often been on Qatar, but there, the construction of stadiums and infrastructure for all mega sporting events should be looked at equally, because there were many cases also in Brazil, in South Africa, and just by the nature of the contractual, the host city contractual relationships with vendors and service providers, that's where also safeguards need to be put in place, so to speak. So I know that we had a roundtable event in Doha a couple of weeks ago, which was focused on the prevention of trafficking at mega sport events, and a number of the speakers that were present that are involved, with host city, that were involved in host city activations. What they're working towards doing now is making sure that these contracts have anti-trafficking safeguards within them, making sure that contracts, that the work that they're doing with transportation companies, with hospitality, that they're doing the trainings, that they're doing, they're putting measures in place to protect these these criminal acts from happening. I mean, as far as sex trafficking, there is this is something that is very political. I came to understand during the latter part of the production of this report, because especially in the US, what is being said there by authorities, so to speak, is that it's not that there's an increase in sex trafficking. It's just that because there's more awareness raising and because there's more publicity in terms of hotlines and call centers, that there, for that reason alone, and only for that reason alone, there are more reports or more reporting. However, having attended many of these mega sports events and World Cups, and having colleagues in that same environment, they will tell you that it is very clear that there are, quite a number of sex workers, so to speak, and that are within the periphery of these events, and one can only, it's maybe easier to identify them as such because they would not be nationals of those countries, which suggests then that they have been brought in from they have been brought in from other parts of the continent or other parts of the world to service the population and those that are around these events. So personally, and I think even in a more common sense manner or logically, one can see a correlation and why there would be an increase of sex workers around these activities. And but then the research is the research that has been put out there primarily by American institutions suggests that that is not the case. It's simply because there's more reporting.
Again, a lot of that makes sense, but it's still quite an important issue in that it's highlighting the fact that trafficking for sexual purposes exists, and it, like you just said there, it makes common sense that if there's a huge sporting event and therefore lots of people, those people who've already been trafficked are being utilized to maximize their value, for what they're there for the people making money from them in these environments where there's a lot of people, so therefore could potentially make more income. And they are moved to these events at those times. But the fact that it's highlighting that this is happening, I think, is also an important issue. And sport can again be there to raise the profile of this as a broader issue in society. It is probably a key point to mention. Conscious of time, and really appreciate you guys going through the detail and the depth of the concept around these three key issues of trafficking in sport, through sport, and around sport. And your report clearly highlights many case studies. Go read it, go and see the case studies. It really brings it to life. So we mentioned at the start, the report is there to try and raise the profile, but what's the next steps? What recommendations are provided that we're actually, now we know this is happening, or we know even more detail what's happening? How can we do something to change this?
Before we get to that, Martin, let me add this as well. The other innovative aspect or novel aspect of the report is this reconceptualization of sport trafficking. We are providing working definition in order to enable stakeholders, core actors to understand this problem better. But also what we did, as I think the discussion shows, due to the complexity of the problem, we also develop typologies. Because as you can see here, when we talk about each subset dimension of the problem, you've got different actors engaging in the exploitation. So, and that was the sort of thought process and idea behind the typology. And it's seminal work in that respect. The existing research doesn't have such typology, but there is that aspect under the report as well. Again, just to enhance and our understanding and help the stakeholders to understand this problem further. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Serhat. Thank you.
Well, in terms of the impact that we would like to see and would like the report to have is that, hopefully it helps sporting bodies in particular to maybe strengthen, any existing regulations that might be in place and hopefully also inform athlete recruitment and transfers. In terms of definitely we want to see improved, legislative efforts. A key stakeholder in all of this, again, the report was supported and partnered. The partnership was through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK. So it was more or less framed for the use of policymakers, parliamentarians, and we're hoping that they would be able to, develop specific anti-trafficking provisions for sport, either by creating sport trafficking legislation that aims at preventing exploitation and trafficking of athletes, or including provisions, for example, in existing national anti-trafficking legislation. And also, and maybe Serhat can expand on this, I think it would also support, the harmonization of laws across, say, jurisdictions and just in general help better to tackle, some of these transnational cases, because most of these cases tend to be transnational in general. So I think that's and policy, obviously, that's something that we've been advocating, policy change as Mission 89, and we've always aimed to influence policy development and I think this report, does that very well through its recommendations.
I think this is excellent summary, Lerina, in terms of what we want to achieve, and obviously for us as a sort of research team and who has been collaborating to tackle this problem, is that first of all we want to eradicate this problem. I mean that's our sort of big vision and ambition, and we hope that. The report helps with that process. And myself, as a sort of academic researcher, I think for us is also to advance the research and academic work on this topic, because as I said earlier at the start of our discussion, we need more research. It's still, we are, scratching the surface. We need to understand now these different types, different subsets. We need to, for instance, we have been also talking about the role of technology in this. Obviously, this is, if we look at our understanding and earlier academic work on this, limited academic work on this topic, it was through field studies and observations. But what we are seeing now, particularly those, for instance, in the world of football, where FIFPro has got a helpline and receive sort of notifications and requests in terms of trafficking from the victims, that this space also moving to online now. So there's a lot of engagement with the victims happening through online, and then exploitation is also facilitated through technological advancements. For instance, this is something we need to really pay attention to. So hopefully, it will help with advancing the research and foster further research on this topic that we really want to tackle.
And also, just to add, Martin, because this is something that that I honed in on at the beginning of the project, Serhat, if you recall, is that this report is certainly not intended to be a research. Well, I mean, obviously, the fundamentals, the foundation it's grounded on research, but it's so important for it to have a practical impact. And again, just referring to the last advocacy event that we had, the Doha Roundtable, coordination was something that was brought up because this is a multi-stakeholder issue. I always say that, it's not, human trafficking is a multi-stakeholder issue and therefore requires a multi-stakeholder solution. And one of the key actors in all of this is law enforcement, right? Because this is a crime. So human trafficking is a crime. Sport trafficking is a crime. And even with all the well-intended policies and well-intended, regulations, sport regulatory changes that might be put in place, at the end of the day, you need these cases to be prosecuted. And so we need to have better coordination between sport organizations and law enforcement. And I think this report, especially through the interpretive guide, which we didn't really touch on, maybe we can invite another colleague of ours to present on that. Oh, well, sorry, I'm not going to invite someone to your podcast without
Maybe.
But the interpretive guide is such an important aspect of, and a tool really, if we were to call it as such, because it helps, it could help, for example, law enforcement with victim identification, for example, and because it provides a guide on how to identify and distinguish between the various forms of trafficking and sports trafficking as and so I think that is, that's really key, and as well through the recommendations could lead to, effective prevention strategies and to enhance Mission 89's capacity building. We've done trainings for law enforcement, for policymakers. We have conducted workshops for CAF, for FIFA. We just recently completed the development of a FIFA agent ethical recruitment guide. So I think this report is a great foundation for practical intervention on this issue.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and this podcast is all about research to practice. So Serhat's, talked in depth there about the research and moving that field forward. But the most important thing is making a difference. And in this case, making a huge difference to sports trafficking. I think kind of in summary, it's been really interesting to hear you talk about these three different elements of sport trafficking and the impact that you want this report to have. You've obviously got many of these stakeholders at the table around policy and legislation and trying to bring everybody together. I think on the broader aspects of trying to raise this profile, and as we know with policy and legislation, the more pressure that can be put on the situation, the higher it can be raised up that political chain, the better it is. So I think in addition to the stakeholders that you're working with already, having clubs being more aware of this issue and having coaches and having fans more aware of this issue, I think hopefully brings it back down to this. We've talked about numbers. We've talked about legislation and policy and all these changes. But for me, the center of this, which everybody needs to remember, is we're talking about children being trafficked. Okay. And your work is trying to have a major impact. And in your words, Serhat, to eradicate sports trafficking of children. And that is what's happening. And I think that needs to stay at the center of everybody's thinking, because all the work that you guys are doing comes back to a child being moved from their home and left in a very difficult situation, regardless of any of the situations that were, whether it was intended or unintended. they're left and there's a child there that's been exploited, trafficked, and left in a very vulnerable state. So if this report can raise that profile and raise the understanding that people have of this situation, hopefully it adds more weight to all this great work that you're all doing at this kind of higher level to develop the legislation and the policy. I hope that summarizes everything well and leaves that with people to think about the child as the center of this.
Again, personally, you see it in the SDGs, and it speaks strongly about eradication, and I mean, this is an issue that is not going to ever be eradicated, right? What we want to do, I think, is to prevent it as much as possible, because I don't know how real we want to be with all of this, right? Because it's driven by economic factors, right? So as long as people can benefit from other people, whether it's sports or any, as long as other people can exploit other people for benefit, there will always be exploitation, right? So what we seek to do is to provide tools, to provide knowledge, understanding, to mitigate it. But if we speak about eradication, that is, there's so many other factors that influence what is happening that are beyond sport. So for example, in my view, again, we can use whatever, but the national governments have a huge role to play in all this, because one way of solving the issue is by making sure that sport administration is improved in countries, that the infrastructure the football infrastructure is improved, or sport infrastructure is improved, that young people can have a sustainable income in their country, so that they can stay in their country longer. And that can only happen if the infrastructure, if there's a possibility for that to happen in their country. And so, I think that
it's a really interesting piece that we could talk more about. And again, spoke to Faisal, who does some work developing football for FIFA, and we spoke about that to an extent around trying to keep African players playing in Africa and raising the profile of their leagues and raising the infrastructure around their league and that side of things, which is, so I think things, like you said, things are happening all over the place to try and bring this all together. But in the aspect that you're looking at, the legal side, and getting more people to court and putting, and reducing this happening, I think is a very important piece of that huge jigsaw that I'm talking about, just in sport, but that then exists within that microcosm of society in general.
Because there are all these regulatory, I would say, ambiguities, even with the FIFA Article 19, and basically you have agents and these nefarious characters, others that are exploiting the loopholes. Right. So sometimes the regulation is there to protect minors or to protect athletes, but because there are all these loopholes, they get around it. But one other aspect of consideration is, for example, when we conduct these Naughty Now Game campaign, one of the learnings that we have received from and the data is that most of the young people would actually prefer to stay home. Most of them are not looking to come to Europe or the US or wherever to become millionaires or to become the next Samuel Eto'o or Didier Drogba. Most of them were saying that if they could earn a decent living playing football, which is what they love, at home, they would rather stay with their families. And that rang, and there was no reason for them to, to not tell the truth in that regard. But that is what we have heard consistently, through these youth forums.
That that shouldn't be as powerful a statement as it is, because that should, in my head, be obvious, right? You want to stay at home, you want to earn a living, all the rest of it.
Yes.
The fact I found that statement to be, I don't know, surprising is, it says a lot, I think, in the, you know, many of us will sit there thinking, you know, the dream is to move to Europe or move to America and all this stuff. Actually, it's not.
Yeah.
It's the necessity,
Yes.
because they want to earn money and they want to help their family.
Yeah.
And
And
I
they
think
want to
that's a
play
huge
football,
point you've
but
made there.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But Lerina, I always said, and I think that should be like, at least for me, it would be a next frontier to look at. But and it comes back, as you said, it's huge. But in terms of particularly trafficking in sport, for me, it's about creating sport ecosystems, and particularly that needs to be at club level, where the athletes, the players, they are safe, right? If we can do that, right, then in terms of moving someone from one country, one context to another, in my view, as long as they are moving into a safe context, like from, obviously I talk about it from the perspective of children rights and right-based approach, where, for instance, if you take a 14-year-old from Nigeria to, I always use this example, to La Masia in Barcelona, where, and if you can move the family, and that's the issue with the regulations that we are challenging. If you can have the family, if you can give them accommodation, if you can give them education alongside football, I don't see any problem there, right?
And when you look at other sectors, I mean, look at the educational system, right? There is you have all these geniuses, prodigies that are 14, 15-year-old, African or Asian, and they get to go to Harvard, or they get to, you know, come to England and study. And there's a pathway there. You know, there are all these safeguards that the system has put into place to allow them to, you know, to study and to live without being compromised. And one of it, you know, one of those safeguards probably is that they highly vet the families, you know, that they're going to stay in, or they ensure that the school ensures that you know, they're participating in other social activities that are part of, you know, their age, within their age group. And so, similar to what you're saying, I think a similar structure and framework needs to be created within the sport ecosystem to facilitate that safe pursuit of a professional career in sport.
Because what you are talking here is that creation of that ecosystem. Why we have students coming to us, because we've got that ecosystem, right? We've got Love Harvard test. So that's, I think, where, and like it's really interesting. All this is done through licensing system, right? I mean, if you think about, like, how do we bring international students to Loughborough? Loughborough sponsors them. And to have that sponsor, you need educational license from Home Office, right? Which obliges number of conditions for Loughborough to broad these international students. And then Loughborough becomes responsible for their welfare progression academically and complete their degree program. And then eventually Loughborough also responsible upon completion, sending them back to their country. And obviously now in the UK, for instance, we've got, they can stay, so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make, we've got this existing system where responsibility is on the entity rather than the individual.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because without mentioning the name of the club, Premier League club, when we were having this conversation, and the club CEO said that, well, you know, once if they are cut, and that's an American term, from the academy at 15, 16, we give them back to the agent, and whatever happens, you know, to
Crazy,
them
right?
thereafter, our responsibility has ended. But that should not be the case, should it?
No.
But that's the mindset that, the relationship is with the agent, and who knows what sort of character and what sort of, this agent is. But that's it. That's the end of our duty of care.
That's a wider issue with football as well. That's one of my pet hates. So this is not just on exploiting, people from different countries. That children are exploited, and it's not just football, but I know football best. Children are exploited as part of football. People can be in a football academy for whatever 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and then just get dropped. And there's no support for them. And they've had this thing. They've had a life where they are part of an academy, and they've built up their friendships in those academies. They're not allowed to play in their local area and build connections there, and then they get released. And everybody thinks they're the superstar. Yeah. And they have been, because they're at this professional club. Then they get released. They've got no support network. They've got no social support from the club that they should, in my opinion, should have also been playing for to build up that network. And they are often mental health issues and many, many problems. So it's a bigger issue in football in general as well. On top of this, so that expectation for football clubs is just we don't want them. Off you go. And I 100% agree with you. Going back to the HE thing, that tier 4 visa, there was many dodgy universities set up to bring people in to exploit them. So this isn't just a problem in sport. People see that framework and actually use the framework for illegitimate purposes. So I agree with you. Going back to the eradicating, I agree. Sadly, it's not going to happen. But I don't mind putting the story out of the aim is to actually make that happen. Thank you for coming on. Really has been a pleasure to talk to you about this, and I hope we do get that message across. So thanks for coming on, and there may be other places where we can speak about this in the future.
Absolutely, and thank you for having us.
Thanks for your invite, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.